Hey everyone, welcome back to the I Believe podcast. I'm Megan and I have the wonderful Dr. Mehmi here with me today. Welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited you're here. So, we're going to talk about some updates and some history, some things coming from ASCO. So, let's kind of give them a brief overview of what we're going to touch on today.
Right. So, Megan, as you know, ocular melanoma is an important disease, even though it's rare. But there's been a lot going on over the last, say, 5 to 7 years, right? Because, prior to that, we didn't really have any adequate therapies for this disease. We were using, whatever was available for other types of melanoma or other cancers and trying to see if we could improve some of the outcomes. But I'm happy to say that, the first ever drug was approved for uveal melanoma for stage 4 or unresectable disease. And that was Kimtrak. And since then, there's been a tide that's been shifting, and more research is getting done to get this disease controlled even before it becomes metastatic. So we'll take the time today to look at some of the background of the disease. What are some of the numbers? What's the prognosis of different subtypes? How do we classify this disease? And then also we'll look at liver-directed therapy once the ocular melanoma recurs in the liver. And then we'll look at systemic therapy when it's beyond the liver or even within the liver. And then I also wanted to focus on some of the combination approaches for stage 4 uveal melanoma, and also what are some of the studies that were presented at ASCO 2025. And some of them are pretty exciting because those are the patients who have been previously treated with a number of therapies, and some of them don't respond as we want them to, as we would like them to. So these therapeutic options hopefully will get those individuals in control as well.
That sounds fantastic. That's a hefty lineup. So, you guys stay tuned because we got a lot to go over.
So we could start off with sort of, where does uveal melanoma develop? I mean, there are, 3 or 4 different compartments where uveal melanoma can develop. It could be iris, the ciliary body, or the choroid itself. And typical symptoms can be, sort of changes in vision or flashes of light, sometimes eye pain, things like that. Or sometimes on a routine exam at a retinal exam, somebody will find something and it starts the workup. As far as the numbers are concerned, it's not the most common melanoma, right? But it is the most common type of tumor in adult as far as the eye tumors are concerned. In the kids, it's retinoblastoma, but in adult population, uveal melanoma is the most common ocular malignancy, and it represents only about 5% of all melanomas. And there were about 2,000 cases annually, and 8,000 cases globally. And there are some risk factors, but the typical assumption that it's related to sunlight and all that, we don't really know about that. But some of the, having a freckle in that area, or having some BAP1 and F1 germline mutation, a syndrome called dysplastic Neva syndrome. These are some of the associations with uveal melanoma. And unfortunately, once you treat the primary disease within the eye itself, about 50% will go on to develop metastatic disease, with 90+% having liver predominant metastases in combination with lungs and other spaces. In the past, we didn't have greatest of survival for this disease. Only about, 1 year survival was about 13 to 25%. And, the outcomes were very dismal. But like I said, in the last few years, there's a tremendous amount of progress that's been made with first approval of Kimtrak that we'll go over, that's improved the overall survival. And then now we're developing some targeted therapy options where we're looking at some key mistakes in the uveal melanoma, how it survives, and then trying to interrupt those signaling pathways to see if we can control the disease. We don't typically use the, staging system for this. I mean, most of the time it's based on the base diameter and the height of the tumor within the eye. So that'll give us some staging, but more often we rely on the classes, and that's the genetic sort of characteristics of this cancer. Based on that, it's divided into class 1, and then class 1 is divided into A and B, and class 2, and then other characteristics, genetics like brain positivity and chromosomal abnormalities will give us a good idea what the risk of recurrences for this uveal melanoma is down the road. With that information, we can tailor make a follow-up, right? If somebody is at low risk of recurrences, they may not need the scans as often versus somebody who's at high risk of recurrences. So not only it gives us the idea of, who's going to recur for the most part, allows us, how to follow these patients, and 3, develop clinical trials to intervene early on before the advanced disease develops to see if we can reduce the risk of recurrences. And I will go over some of those, actually 2 adjuvant clinical trials that are trying to achieve that goal. So once the ocular melanoma within the eye has been treated with either radiation, plaque therapy, or proton beam therapy, and rarely enucleation, we subdivide these patient populations into low risk of recurrences, intermediate risk of recurrences, high risk of recurrences based on the classification that I talked about. And the test that we use is called by a company called Castle Bioscience, and Decision DXUM is the test that we use. And the high risk patients that have, within the next 3 to 5 years after their initial disease is treated, they have a risk of recurrence is much higher for those individuals. In the past, we've had a number of different clinical trials with using medications that were already available for other diseases and see if we can reduce the risk of recurrences. But the outcomes weren't, at what we wanted. The reduction in recurrences wasn't worth the toxicity that it brings, and the treatment tended to be for a year or more. So because of that, it's not very popular to use those treatments for these patients. Rarely we see a handful of patients who've been exposed to drugs like sunitinib and things like that to reduce their risk of recurrences. But now we're looking at actually 2 different trials. One of them is with the drug that's already approved for stage 4 disease, that is tebentafusp or Kimmtrak. Unfortunately, that drug is reserved for a certain group of patients who have an HLA subtype A0201. So if you have that subtype and you're high risk for recurrences, soon multiple cancer centers will have the clinical trial called ATOM, ATOM. And essentially, it'll look at patients with high risk of recurrences and then randomize them to either observation with imaging, scanning for any recurrences versus giving them Kimmtrak for 1 year. And then we'll follow the patients and see if we can reduce the risk of recurrences and get the drug have it be available early on if it's successful in reducing risk of recurrences. Like I said, that trial should be available within the next 2 to 3 months. So I urge patient 1, when they do get diagnosed with uveal melanoma, have the Castle Bioscience test done so we know if they're high risk or not. And if they are high risk, I urge them to find a center nearby and participate. And we'll be one of the centers in Southern California. So I'm happy to help any of the individuals that are looking. And the second trial is from Dr. Jose Lutsky over at the University of Miami Sylvester Cancer Center. And Dr. Lutsky and the ocular oncology team at Dallas Southwestern, they looked at a molecule called HDAC4 inhibitor. And the HDAC4 or some of that mechanism, if it's uninterrupted, it allows these genes to be made into proteins that allow uveal melanoma cancers to spread or recur. By giving that HDAC inhibitor, we're suppressing those gene products and not allowing the cancer to sort of come back and spread, so simply put. And So that particular drug is looking at about, I think, 60 patients. And here it's not a randomized trial. It'll have a synthetic control, meaning some of the historical data that we have for that kind of matched group of patients, see if we can reduce the risk of recurrences. And the drugs, I believe, is given about either twice or three times a week. I'll have to check the details on that. And the really good thing about this trial is that you could have had your eye tumor, uveal melanoma, treated about 6 months prior. So usually these trials look to start treatment within about 3 months of initial treatment. But here we have a longer time to act. Again, we'll be looking at high-risk patients with the Castle Bioscience testing. And so that's another, and also this trial isn't restricting patients with only HLA A0201 like the KIMTRAC trial is. Okay. And then, so that's the second. And the third trial, we have some initial data by Dr. Suti Rapsawan from DC area. He had presented at ASCO last year individuals treated with Opdivo and Yervoy or ipilimumab, nivolumab, and showed decreased risk of recurrences with a significant margin. And that trial was in a smaller number of patients, but it's going to get expanded and into a phase 3 study. I think that's another trial that won't restrict patients to their HLA subtyping. So that trial probably is a little bit further down the pike, but it should be coming up soon. So in a disease where we didn't even have, metastatic treatment approved by the FDA, now we're talking about, stepping early on, trying to reduce the risk of recurrences after initial disease diagnosis and treatment. And so that just speaks to the progress that we're trying to make in this disease space. So
Absolutely.
that's
It's a
the
big deal.
future, right? That is a huge deal, right? And then since these trials are still attempting to achieve those goals, that means, some of those high risk patients that don't have access to these trials, or we don't know if these trials are going to be able to, accomplish their preset goal. That means that 50% of the patients will still have disease recurrences in the liver and other places. So what are some of the treatment options that are already approved in this space? Those options are, we look at where the disease is, how big or how much disease burden there is. What kind of makeup does the patient have? Are there a lot of medical problems that would, kind of cause issues if we gave them one treatment versus another? Do they have autoimmune problems? Things like that. So how much disease, where the disease, the makeup of the person, that will help us decide how should we tackle their advanced disease once it's recurred. If it's, a few spots, one or two spots in the liver, you can go after them with what's called liver-directed therapy. So why expose the patient to, toxic treatments with long-term side effects potentially, when you can just target the liver itself, those spots. And then there's a group of patients that will have long-term control with that. But most of the time, these liver-directed therapies, for example, chemoembolization, immunoembolization, RFA, all these treatments, they'll have disease control, but eventually new disease pops up. So for those patients, one of the other liver-directed therapy option is the hepatic perfusion with melphalan. And that's approved as Hepzato based on the phase 3 trial Focus, and showed, really good disease control. Overall response rate in these patients were about 32%, median PFS of 9 months. And that data has been updated, and that's, kind of holding steady. And now there's sort of another approach with Hepzato or hepatic perfusion with melphalan in combination with Opdivo and Yervoy. This trial is called And this particular trial is coming out of Europe, and they treated only about less than 10 patients, but showed remarkable responses. Almost like 5 out of 7 patients had disease control. And it seems like when we treat the liver with metastases, there is sort of a negative impact on the immune system by having metastatic disease in the liver. And once you treat the liver, that negative impact of the liver on the immune system is taken away. So Opdivo and Yervoy perhaps works better to control the disease. So that trial is actually getting expanded. So we'll look to see its results in the next few months. I think it's going to get reported at ESMO or perhaps ASCO or one of these major conferences soon. So we're looking forward to that. So that's the combination study where we're looking at liver-directed therapy in addition to rest of the body treatment as well to improve survivals, reduce risk of progression, and improving these survival advantages. And then obviously we can't go any further without talking about Kimmtrak. It's the sort of the first drug that was ever approved for metastatic uveal melanoma for patients who are HLA A0201 positive. And it showed that when you give patients Kimmtrak versus physician's choice treatment, that you improve the overall survival. And that benefit's been, first it was reported in New England Journal of Medicine as 1 year overall survival advantage, and now it's been updated to 3 years and subsequently. And the one of the really good thing about Kimmtrak is that we can predict its toxicity and then make sure that the patient tolerate these drugs. Most of the toxicity happened within the first 3 treatments. And after that, the risk of toxicity is really low. Most of the time, it's limited to rash, occasional fever, but any of the low blood pressures, fever, chills, any of those, they tend to be limited through the first 3 treatments. And they're really, we have enough experience to sort of, reliably control those issues and keep the patients on the drug. And then there are ongoing studies of Kimmtrak with other things, to see if we can improve the responses with Kimmtrak. So we talked about Hepzato, we talked about Kimmtrak. There are 2 trials that looked at Opdivo and Yervoy or Ipi/Nivo. One was Dr. Patel's trial from MD Anderson, now at Colorado University. And another one was from Spain. And both of them pretty much identical. Response rates were 18 to 20%. Toxicity that we know of Ipi/Nivo from other disease spaces. So that's an option for some of those patients who have, they don't have autoimmune problems or they have significant amount of disease in others. So it's something we can try, but it's not sort of the first thing we reach for because we know that Opdivo Yervoy has significant risk of toxicity with colitis in about 30 to 40% of the patients. A lot of the patients tend to have rash, hypothyroidism that's immune mediated, and then risk of liver, lung, kidney injuries, in measurable numbers. So something that's available, but we consider the patient makeup seriously before we consider those treatments. And then, so those are what's available in our toolkit now, right? What's coming down the pike is something exciting. My senior partner, Dr. Hamid, presented some of the data for a second sort of similar drug to Kimmtrak that targets a different marker called PRAME on uveal melanoma cells. And that was presented a few years ago at ESMO. And we had probably here at our site the most number of patients for that uveal melanoma. And they had durable control, and that this is not any confidential data. This is data that's already presented. So I'm hoping at some point Immunocore will consider, bringing back their PRAME targeting bispecific into the uveal melanoma space. Right now, they're trying to develop it more into the cutaneous melanoma, but I'm sure they have considerations of bringing it back at some point. At least we'll continue to champion that.
Can you explain PRAME for anybody that doesn't know what that is?
Yeah, so PRAME is a sort of a you can think of it as a protein that's present in developing cells when we are becoming who we are in utero, and then at some point that PRAME antigen disappears. But in melanoma, it comes back and is expressed all over again. Um, and it's a poor prognosis marker in cutaneous melanoma and uveal melanoma, but it's targetable as well. So PRAME antigen, the drug from an immunocore called brenetafusp, on one end, it has the T cell activating moiety, the CD3 binding, and the other end is PRAME. So not only it activates the T cells, it also brings the active T cells in proximity of the uveal melanoma cell because it has that PRAME target. So it's a matchmaker in a sense, but also kills the melanoma cells from that activity. So that's PRAME, and PRAME's not just present in the melanoma. There's ovarian cancer that have PRAME on it, non-small cell lung cancer, endometrial cancer. So some of the other cancers also express PRAME. So the immunocore drug brenetafusp has a long reach from that, at least hypothetically speaking. So this data set was presented by Dr. Hamid at ESMO in 2022, I believe, and it had about 5 patients with uveal melanoma, and 3 of those 5 had durable responses. So that's something, we are always advocating for these therapies, and talked to Immunocore multiple times to sort of, relook at, this particular molecule in uveal melanoma space. And I'm hoping, down the road, they'll consider that. The biggest news since immune therapy in melanoma in general is, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, where we're able to take one of the representing tumor in the body, surgically remove it, and then isolate the lymphocyte from these tumors and expand them and reinfuse them into patients where we got those cells from. And that's shown, I'd say, amazing benefit in cutaneous melanoma. And a drug named Amtagvi or lifileucel from Iovance is already approved for refractory melanoma. And that story is also developing in uveal melanoma. The data is very limited. It's not reliable at the moment. But University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in Pittsburgh does have a trial for TIL therapy in uveal melanoma. So, that's something to consider for some of the selected patients. The challenge with TIL therapy is, there are components to TIL therapy that are fairly difficult to tolerate. There's a 5 days of chemotherapy associated with prior to TIL infusion. The TIL infusion itself is, I'd say, relatively easy. Typically gets, patients will have low-grade fevers and chills, just sort of a T-cell mediated reaction. But after the cell infusion, then we have to support these T cells with interleukin-2, which can be potentially toxic in short term and in the long run. Typically, we give up to 6 doses of interleukin-2, and that can cause low blood pressures, heart rate issues. Sometimes it can cause, significant edema in the lungs and other places. So that interleukin-2 is given in intensive care setting. So that's the challenge of TIL. So that's why we have to select these patients really carefully. What's coming down the pike? So those are something that they're available within the clinical trial setting or as standard of care. But the 3 trials that I thought were really important in uveal melanoma, they were the one trial we highlighted with Ipi, Nivo, and Hepzato, showing really good controls. And then also the trial that I forgot to name was Chopin trial, CHOPIN. That's the Hepzato with Ipi-Nivo. That trial is going to be reported sometime soon in the next couple of months. Not couple of months, in a couple of meetings, I'd say. And then in the future, what should we looking at would be one study is called Ocule 1, OCULE-01. This trial in progress was presented as an abstract by Dr. Paul Nathan out of the UK. And this particular trial is trying to look at how can we take away some of the brakes that are put on by the immune system onto itself. And that leads to less of an immune surveillance of the uveal melanoma tumors. And to do this, there's a drug that is developed that targets a particular enzyme called PI3 kinase C delta. And by giving that drug, it targets that particular enzymes in the T regulatory cells. So that's the brake on your immune system. By giving that drug, you're decreasing the T regulatory cell population, which means there's a less of a brake onto the immune system. And then the active component of the immune system called cytotoxic T cells, they can act towards the uveal melanoma much better than they did before. So that's a trial that's coming. It's open, it's accruing. I'm sure it'll make its way into the US as well, but right now it's in the UK. And then obviously the clinical trial from Replimune with RP2 is another interesting study. So RP2 is sort of a vaccine that has the most of the component of the vaccine is an HSV1 virus, but it's that the part of the DNA that makes HSV infectious is taken out, but then added parts to this are a molecule called, or the programming gene called PD1 and CTLA4. So it's able to sort of wake up the immune system when we inject this particular vaccine or virus, inoculate virus, into the tumor itself and also give immunotherapy. They presented their initial data on a few patients a couple of years back and showed good responses. So now it's been expanded into a phase 3 study. That's ongoing, and that was a trial in progress at ASCO. The other trial that looks very promising, this is from ASCO 2025, was first in human study of DYP688. Now, what the heck is that? Now, we know that uveal melanoma, most of the uveal melanoma have this sort of genetic alteration in two proteins, GNA11 and GNAQ. Okay, almost 90+% of the patients with uveal melanoma have that mutation. So there are a couple of different strategies to go after that because most of the melanoma will have that, or uveal melanoma will have that alteration. IDEA Pharmaceutical is using darovasertib with crizotinib to disrupt this continuous information that flows through this mutation, right? So that phase 2 trial is ongoing. Their phase 2 study looked, a single arm study, had really good data, benefit in these patients, but the treatment is somewhat toxic with diarrhea, rash, nausea, vomiting, but there are ways the protocol set up in place to control those side effects. So one is using oral drugs to control that continuous information through that mutation of GNA11 and GNAQ. The other is, can we use that mutated or altered protein that is made from GNA11 and GNAQ mutated gene as an address to identify those cells and deliver a payload that can target those cells? So that way you're avoiding any of the normal cells because they won't have that mutation, right? So the DYP688 is a first-in-class double targeted antibody and drug conjugate. Antibody-drug conjugate in general is an antibody attached to a toxin. So the antibody portion will recognize something in the cells, on the surface of the cells, and binds. When that target is bound, that antibody-drug conjugate gets internalized into the cells, and the toxin gets released and it kills the cells. So that's the antibody-drug conjugate. Sometimes they're an off-target effect. So here, it's sort of a double target. There's a one target called PMEL, PMEL 17 or GP100, and the other target is that it delivers not a toxin but a potent inhibitor or disruptor of the information that flows through GNA11 and GNAQ. So not only it's only targeting uveal melanoma cells, but it also delivers a potent drug that disrupts that GNA11, GNAQ mutated sort of signal that's always ongoing and letting these cells grow, metastasize. So this trial is relatively new and showed benefit in individuals who had received prior therapies, and they've tried about 5 different doses, 4 milligram per kilogram, 8 milligram per kilogram, and so on and so forth. And the drug's given every 2 weeks and shown benefit that are, relatively durable. So this is something that we're really excited about coming through into uveal melanoma space. I know it's a bit complex how these drugs work, and in addition, these brand new drugs, sometimes it's difficult to sort of predict their toxicity. But, without clinical trial participation, we won't know. We won't be able to predict their toxicity. We won't be able to sort of have the benefit established and take them further in the future as treatment options. So these were the 3-4 trials that I wanted to highlight that I think we need to access and accrue to so we can expand our tools to help our patients with uveal melanoma.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've talked several times on this podcast about how important a clinical trial is for the whole community. So I love that you're bringing this to us because this is such great information.
Right. I mean, I think if for the longest time, this idea, which is absolutely true, that uveal melanoma is so rare that it's hard to do clinical trials. It's hard to do clinical trials. It's hard to have let it be pharmaceutical industry or whatnot, have them buy in saying, hey, this is a space where you should consider clinical trials, right? So it was difficult before, but now, as medical oncologists, we're kind of binding together. My counterparts, I can count them on my both hands, how many I work with because there are so few of us. And so if I don't have a trial, I'll send them to Dr. Chemlavsky in the neighborhood at UCLA and vice versa. Or I'll call up Stanford, see if they have any trial, Dr. Reddy, Dr. Beethoff Warner, see if they have a trial so we can collaborate. UCSD, same thing. And then if nothing in this area, okay, let's see Colorado. Dr. Sapna Patel is in there. Amazing mind for uveal melanoma. She can help us with the trial. So the community is so, medical oncology for uveal melanoma is so close-knit that we tend to sort of, lean on each other to help our patients. And I think that's made the difference for getting Kimmtrak approved. Hopefully that'll be the reason why Kimmtrak gets, showing benefit in adjuvant setting. Same thing with the HDAC4 inhibitor. Same thing with Ipi/Nivo in adjuvant setting. So I think this sort of a network that we have of medical oncologists that are truly championing these treatments for uveal melanoma patients, it's absolutely making the difference.
I love that. That's so great. The fact that you guys are all coming together, it's so huge for the community, and we just appreciate everything you're doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a huge sort of kudos goes out to Ocular Insight and other nonprofit organizations that are actually, making the difference too. Because you guys are always on the horn about, clinical trials, about, advocacy, patient advocacy, and talking to pharmaceutical industry, leveraging that relationship to get these trials going. I think a big kudos goes out to you guys as well, because without that, we won't have the platform to reach out to the masses.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, we're all here doing our part, just trying to move the needle and move the mountain and do whatever we can do. So, thank you to everyone tuning in watching this also, because you guys watching this is what is bringing all of the
Right.
information to you. We can't do it without the viewers. So thank you to you and to our sponsors.
Yeah, no, exactly. I
Yeah.
think it's a village that
Yes.
is responsible for all the progress, right? One person in
Yeah.
the silo cannot do that. So I think it's all the parties involved, all the stakeholders that have deep interest in improving the outcomes in this disease. They all deserve a pat on the back.
Absolutely. And like you said, it takes a village. We're all in this together. And it's great to see everybody come together. I think it's a really cool thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my favorite things about going to these small conferences or big conferences is they can have all these medical oncologists that have interest in uveal melanoma just sit together and it's like, what can we do next? How can we collaborate? What can we bring forth, either as academic institute research versus, affiliation with the pharmaceutical industry. How can we work together? And every single one of them have pretty much the same goal. So and it's really encouraging to see that.
I agree. Yeah, it's wonderful. So, Dr. Mehmi, thank you so much for being here. I have enjoyed this and I have learned so much. And I know I speak for the whole audience that we just really appreciate your time and all of that wealth of information that you just brought us.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the platform to talk about it. And, I'm always optimistic that we're going to move the needle in the right direction in the future.
Absolutely. And we look forward to having you back on in the future to talk about more updates that are coming. So, everyone, subscribe if you want to see more from Dr. Mehmi in the future. He will be back, as well as hopefully we could get, a lot more great information. And if you want to see that and you want it to continue to come, it's very important that you subscribe anywhere that you get a podcast or to our YouTube channel, because that is what keeps our sponsors sponsoring us. And with that, a huge thank you to our sponsors. This podcast would not function without the sponsors. So thank you. Thank you to them. This is really such a vital platform to bring this information to the public, and we can't do it without all of you, like we said before. So thank you to everyone. Please go to our website, acurensight.org. At the top, there's a button to subscribe to our newsletter. It goes out once a month. We send all kinds of great information on clinical trials and other information you need to stay up to date in the OM community. So please subscribe to our newsletter and please follow our social media. We are on all the platforms. Please find us and like and comment and let us know what you guys want to see from us, because we're always looking for suggestions of what the community is looking for. We want to bring you what you want. So let us know what that is. And until next time, I hope you stay well and we will see you next time.